Hey, so we're here with Julius Kim, the president of TGC. How long has it been?
It's been 2 years, a little over 2 years now.
So you count your days along with the pandemic then?
Exactly, yeah. So I became president in February of 2020, then the pandemic hit 1 month later.
Oh my goodness.
So it was quite a challenging first year.
Okay. In addition, you're taking over for Tim Keller.
Well, Tim Keller, yes. So we have two founders, as you know.
Right.
Don Carson and Tim Keller founded the organization. And Don was the president. So
Okay.
Don Carson was the president of TGC. So he retired. And then now I have the privilege of trying to fill those shoes.
Oh my. So take us behind the scenes a little bit. How has it been being the president of perhaps one of the most influential Christian evangelical organizations, at least among the conservative Christians in the country, perhaps in the world? How has it been leading that organization?
Yeah, on the one hand, it's been a tremendous honor and privilege to be able to be part of an organization that actually brings like-minded Christian leaders together around the gospel. I mean, what can be greater, right? But at the same time, at the end of the day, we're just a parachurch. Even though we're large and we have a large influence and a large impact and a large platform, we're not the church. Christ's bride is the church, not TGC or any other parachurch. So I think it's been healthy to remember who we are and who we actually serve. So we serve Christ and His church. And so we exist to serve the church. So I think that's been humbling and good to remind ourselves of that. But in addition to all that, there's been some unique challenges too. And for me as an Asian American, I think there's been a lot of pressure. On the one hand, it's an honor, but I always want to, it's a challenge not to shame my people, so to speak. And I always live with that kind of constant pressure of not wanting to do things to shame my family, shame my culture, and shame my Asian American history and my people, so to speak. And so it's a constant battle that I face, not to be a people pleaser and things like that, and continue to keep Jesus center and keep Him first and keep Him in front, so to speak.
You are naturally, by personality, if I stated negatively, a people person, in a positive way, you're relational.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
But during these years, the political climate, where it's been one of the most divisive time, and you're, as an Asian American, I'm sure you're pulled both ways, and you're not woke enough, or you're too woke. How are you doing that?
Yeah, it's been challenging, Steve. There's no doubt about it. And TGC, prior to these last couple of years, has been able to bring together leaders of various stripes and colors and creeds, et cetera, around our foundation documents and around the gospel. But, the racial tensions, the political polarization has had its impact not only on our nation, but even on a group like an organization like TGC. And so it's been harder, I think, to stay a coalition, because it seems like, whereas the gospel is what keeps us together, it seems like now it's the gospel plus something, like gospel plus this issue or gospel plus that issue. And I think that's created some confusion, but also some division. And that's been challenging. But at the same time, I actually think of it as a wonderful opportunity. Because in the midst of all of these challenges, I think the Lord is prompting us to really ask the question, what really brings us together? Is it the way we vote? Is it whether we wear a mask or not? Or is it really the gospel and all of its simplicity and profundity? And so while it's been incredibly challenging to bring together like-minded people around the gospel, it's also been, I think, a wonderful opportunity to just re-clarify again, right? What is the gospel and why is it important still? And can we be together around that?
So far as you're concerned, it brings you back to the purity of the reason why TGC exists is the purity of the gospel. But what you struggle with is when people want to add to the gospel, and that secondary thing is a litmus test almost. And so that's what you're trying to navigate around.
That's exactly right. And I think for a lot of people, their prioritization has become a little askewed, right? And so No one wants to say that politics, for example, is a bad thing. In fact, it exists all around us. But it's when our political views or convictions seem to, at least in our rhetoric, perhaps not in our hearts, but at least in our rhetoric, seem to be more important or higher priority than, let's say, the gospel. And at least the rhetoric has just created a lot of division and discouragement. And so it's an opportunity, I think, for that clarity. What's priority? What's secondary? What's primary? What's secondary? What's tertiary? But also to say, and when we disagree, can we disagree charitably, in good faith, and say we're still brothers in Christ because of this primary issue called the gospel. We may differ, let's say, on a secondary issue like politics, and that's okay. We can still have this conversation in good faith. But right now, we're just not seeing a lot of good faith.
Do you feel like being an Asian American, it gives you an advantage in some ways?
Yeah, that's a great question. I would like to think so. I'd have to think about that more, but I think because of my unique bicultural upbringing, having lived in Korea, been raised in Korea, but also coming here, I think gives me a unique, compassion and sensitivity to various viewpoints. For example, like just the fact that I don't really feel like an American and I don't really feel like a Korean. When I was growing up, that was really difficult for me because I was really struggling with my own identity. So I traveled to Korea with my family thinking, oh, now I finally feel at home, and I didn't. And then I come back to the States after like a summer vacation with my family, say, oh, I'm at home now. I'm like, no, because I still encounter discrimination and prejudice. But I encountered that in both countries. And so early on when I was young, I found that to be a disadvantage. But now, I actually look back at that history and I'm so grateful for it because it provided me a different perspective on my life here on earth. That I actually, frankly, don't belong here, that I'm on a pilgrimage, that this is not my home. Korea's not my home, America's not my home. My home is in heaven. But in the meantime, can I then take the ethics of heaven and allow it to actually change the way I think, change the way I speak and live, whether I'm in Korea or America? And to contextualize that heavenly ethic in whatever country I'm in. And so the Lord has placed me in America. And so it gives me, there's just kind of that longing for another home, but also this recognition that this other home that I belong to has different ways of thinking and living. Now, how do I bring that to bear upon this unique time and place? And so it just gives me that extra sensitivity, perhaps, but also a little bit more clarity of who I am and where I am. And so, yeah, so all that to say, I'm just so grateful for my bicultural Asian American heritage because I think it gives me that kind of sensitivity as a, can I call it an eschatological pilgrim, that I don't belong here. And so no matter what happens, on the one hand, I don't need to be so discouraged.
Right.
I can still have hope because I belong to another world.
Right. And so the dissonance you feel, while a lot of people consider that as a liability for you, well, that's an asset potentially. It helps you to understand those who feel marginalized, and you are allowed to, in some ways, bridge the gap between those on the very right or the very left. Saying, hey, I can kind of understand both sides.
Absolutely. And what's interesting as a Korean American, when we even talk about race relations in America, it tends to be a black and white conversation. I'm neither black nor am I white. Right. And what's interesting in my conversations with black brothers and white brothers and sisters is that when I talk to my black brothers and sisters, they're like, oh, you get us.
Right.
Because you have experienced racism and prejudice and being marginalized and oppressed, et cetera. And I said, actually, I do. So I can sympathize and empathize with their history. Not in the same way, but I can understand it, I think, and be sensitive to that. And then when I talk to my white brothers and sisters and say, but Julius, as an Asian American, you've made it. You're a minority. You've assimilated. You went to the best schools. You've now reached, the pinnacle of your career in a white-dominated kind of evangelical space. You're like a leader now. So you get what we're saying, right? Actually, I do. And I understand some of the struggles that you have when you have conversations with our black and brown brothers and sisters. And so I think it's a unique opportunity even for me to be just a sensitive listener and learner so that ultimately I can leverage the position I'm in for the sake of unity.
Right.
Yeah, so.
And no offense, but neither Tim Keller nor D.A. Carson could have done that?
Well, they've done a lot.
Right.
And I would, yes. Well, they don't have the kind of unique bicultural experience.
That's what I mean.
And yet, yeah, so in that way, I'm very grateful that the Lord has given me that history that hopefully I can use for the, so let me just say it this way. My past is not a liability, but a benefit for my present and my future.
Right.
And I think the Lord has given me that opportunity.
Right. And it is something God's given to you to be an edifying thing for the greater kingdom.
That's exactly right. And so one of the things I would say to a lot of Asian American church leaders is that instead of being so discouraged about some of the challenges you face because of your Asian American heritage, culture, background, is actually to steward it well, because it's actually a gift. Being Asian American at this time right now, steward it well for the sake of the kingdom, because not many people have that unique experience and opportunities that you will have. And so be prayerful, be sensitive to the Spirit, and then steward that for the sake of the gospel.
That's a wonderful. Can you look at the camera and say to our Asian American brothers and sisters who bemoan the fact that they're in an immigrant church, or grew up in a bicultural home, or whatever it is, and just tell them, no, tell us, hey, this is God's given that to you and stored it. Can you tell us that again?
Absolutely. You know what I would say to many of you in Asian American places or Asian American churches of ministry, I know it's hard. I know it's challenging, but God has placed you there for a reason. And God has given you a very unique gift, which is your bicultural heritage and history. Now, your challenge is going to be, how could I steward this gift well to be a blessing not only to your local community, but to a larger community that needs your voice, your wisdom, and your experience? Because trust me, you will get opportunities. Steward it well for God's kingdom.